Have you ever mapped a universe, convinced that if you could just chart every star, every signal, you would understand the mind of its creator? We pursue knowledge with a kind of holy fervor, believing that data is truth, that what can be measured is all that exists. We build our theories, scaffold by rigorous scaffold, designing experiments so elegant they become a form of worship. We dedicate our lives to deciphering the codes of existence, certain that mastery of the language will grant us control over the narrative. But what happens when you finally hear the music, only to have someone else claim they wrote the symphony? For 30 years, my world was a clean room, a place of filtered air, sterile surfaces, and the quiet, reverent hum of machinery. I was a cellular biologist. To me, a single cell was not a microscopic blob, it was a bustling metropolis, a complex society with its own language, its own economy, its own intricate dance of life and death. I didn't just study cells, I listened to them. My life's work, my entire intellectual and spiritual focus, was dedicated to understanding one specific process: cellular senescence, the phenomenon of aging, not as a disease to be cured, but as a language to be understood. I believed that within the slow, deliberate shutdown of a cell, there was a hidden signal, a lost piece of music. My hypothesis was that aging wasn't a simple decay, but a complex, programmed retreat, and if we could understand the signals that initiated it, we could learn to restore cellular vitality, not by forcing the cell backward, but by reminding it of a song it had forgotten. I called it the symphony of the cell. And the conductor of my world, the man who had first handed me the baton, was Dr. Marcus Vance. He was my mentor, my collaborator, a figure so foundational to my career that his voice was almost indistinguishable from my own inner monologue of scientific inquiry. He found me as a fiery, ambitious graduate student and saw not just raw talent, but a shared obsession. He gave me a corner of his prestigious lab, access to funding, and most importantly, the intellectual freedom to chase an idea everyone else deemed too philosophical, too poetic for serious science. Our relationship was built on a shared reverence for the truth, for the purity of the scientific method. He was the seasoned maestro, I was his prodigy, his first violinist, the one who could hear the subtlest notes in the data. Our Helios project was a specific signaling pathway, a complex cascade of proteins I had dubbed the Luna Cascade in the privacy of my notebooks. For a decade, I meticulously, painstakingly traced its every connection. I designed molecules that could bind to its receptors, listening for a response. I spent countless nights staring into the glowing eye of a confocal microscope, watching the faint pulses of fluorescent tags, feeling like an astronomer searching for signs of intelligent life in a distant galaxy. And one rainy Tuesday in April, I found it. A single, undeniable response. A cohort of senescent cells, when treated with my compound, didn't just stop decaying. They began to clear out their own internal debris, their mitochondrial functions sparked back to life. They didn't get younger, but they became vibrant. It wasn't a reversal, it was a renewal. I had found the conductor's downbeat for the lost symphony. I ran to Marcus's office, my hands trembling, clutching the printouts of the data like sacred texts. He looked at the graphs, his usual stern expression melting into a slow, spreading smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. "You did it, Luna," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "My God, you actually did it." We worked for weeks to verify, to replicate, to write the paper that would shake the foundations of gerontology. We decided to announce the breakthrough at the annual symposium, a joint presentation. It was to be the culmination of my life and the crowning achievement of his legacy. The betrayal, when it came, was not a quiet erasure in a journal. It was a public execution under the bright, hot lights of a press conference stage. The room was packed. The air crackled with anticipation. Marcus had insisted on speaking first to set the historical context. I stood at the side of the stage, my own speech notes clutched in my hand, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. He walked to the podium, a figure of immense gravitas and authority. He spoke of his own early work, of the decades-long search, of the relentless pursuit of an idea. It was the perfect introduction. And then he said the words that vaporized my world. "And today," he announced, his voice booming with feigned humility, "I am profoundly humbled to announce that this long journey has reached its destination. My team and I, building upon the foundations I laid 30 years ago, have finally isolated the key. We have found the mechanism to restore cellular vitality. He presented my data, my graphs, my microscopic images. He even used my term, the symphony of the cell. But he presented it all as the final, brilliant piece of a puzzle he had been solving his entire life. He never said my name. When a journalist in the front row asked about the lead researchers on his team, he smiled paternally. I have been blessed with many diligent and hardworking assistants over the years, all of whom played their part. But a discovery of this magnitude requires a singular vision to guide it home. Diligent assistants. The phrase echoed in the cavernous hall, a death knell for my entire existence. I was not a collaborator. I was not a prodigy. I was a pair of hands. The applause was deafening, a tidal wave of noise that drowned me. I saw my colleagues in the front row, some looking confused, others carefully avoiding my gaze. I didn't wait for my turn at the podium. There was no turn. I slipped out a side door, the sterile air of the convention center feeling like a tomb. My confrontation with him later that day, in the lab that had been my sanctuary, was a lesson in the chilling power of narrative. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't even apologetic. He was disappointed in me. "Luna, you're thinking like an individual, not like a historian," he said, his tone gentle, as if explaining a complex concept to a slow student. "Science needs a clear, authoritative voice, a legacy. It gives the discovery weight, stability. My name provides that. It's for the good of the work, don't you see? Your contribution is cemented in the data itself. That should be enough for any true scientist." He had stolen my life's work and reframed it as my noble sacrifice. For weeks, I tried to fight. I appealed to the university ethics board. I spoke to colleagues. But Marcus was an institution, a giant. I was a diligent assistant, an emotional woman who, they insinuated, couldn't handle the pressure of being part of a great man's success. The world I had built on logic, evidence, and peer-reviewed truth crumbled into a Kafkaesque nightmare of politics and power. My belief in order in a rational universe was the foundation, and it was now sand. The final surrender came a month later. I was watching a late-night talk show, and he was the guest of honor. He was charming, eloquent, a benevolent sage sharing his wisdom with the world. He told a story about how the name, the Symphony of the Cell, came to him one night while listening to Bach, a moment of pure, singular inspiration. And the world believed him. The host, the audience, everyone. They were applauding a beautiful lie. In that moment, the anger, the fight, all of it just drained away. It was replaced by a vast, cold, and terrifying emptiness. The architect of my own universe had been told she was just a bricklayer. And the worst part was, the universe was now celebrating the new architect. I left that night. I didn't pack a bag. I just got in my car and drove. I drove away from the city of logic and ambition. I drove towards the coast, towards the one thing I knew was more powerful and chaotic than any human narrative, the ocean. I found a small, weather-beaten cottage for rent, clinging to a cliff on a rugged, forgotten stretch of coastline. It had once been part of a marine biology station, long since abandoned. It was imperfect, battered by salt and wind, and filled with a profound, roaring silence that was the antithesis of the cleanroom's hum. The first weeks were a special kind of hell. My mind, trained for decades to find patterns and solve problems, tried to run diagnostics on my own grief. It replayed every conversation with Marcus, searching for the flawed variable, the data point I had missed. It was a recursive, agonizing loop. The ocean outside was a constant, violent roar, a mirror of the tempest in my head. There was no order here, no control, only the relentless, brutal rhythm of the tide. Then slowly, through sheer exhaustion, I stopped trying to solve the problem. I started just watching. I would walk down to the shore at low tide and stare into the tidal pools. These were my new Petri dishes. Here were entire universes, teeming with life, all locked in a ferocious, beautiful dance of survival. I saw the slow, deliberate work of the starfish, the frantic scuttling of the crabs, the patient, rooted existence of the anemones pulsing with the water. I saw birth, death, and renewal, not as data points on a graph, but as a visceral, tangible reality. I began to sketch them. At first, it was a reflex, the scientists need to categorize and record. I bought a cheap sketchbook and some charcoal pencils from the nearest town, but it quickly became something else. I wasn't drawing to document, I was drawing to see. I spent hours capturing the intricate spiral of a whelk shell, the delicate, fern-like structure of a seaweed frond, the way light filtered through the water and danced on the sand. My hands, which had once manipulated micropipettes with sterile PR, Estrogen, were now covered in charcoal dust and the grit of the shore. I was no longer imposing a hypothesis on reality. I was letting reality impose its truth upon me. One day, I found a small, translucent jellyfish, stranded in a shallow pool, its life fading with the receding tide. It was beautiful, a delicate ghost, its rhythmic, pulsing bell a faint echo of a heartbeat. In my old life, I would have seen it as a failed specimen, a system shutting down. But now I saw something else. I saw the completion of a cycle. I saw the letting go. I saw a form of senescence that was not a failure, but a surrender to the larger system. The symphony was not just in the renewal, it was in the decay, too. It was all one piece of music. It's past, my sketchbook filled with drawings of shells, crabs, and kelp. The storm in my head quieted, replaced by the rhythm of the tides. One evening, an email notification pinged on my phone, which I rarely checked. It was from a junior colleague, a young, earnest scientist named Ben. Dr. Thorne, it began, I hope this finds you well. We are running into anomalies with the Luna, with the V17 compound. Replications are inconsistent. Dr. Vance's explanations are unsatisfying. The data feels incomplete. There's a piece of the music missing, and I feel like only you know the tune. We need you. The old reflex flared, hot and sharp. Vengeance. Vindication. Here it was on a silver platter. I could go back, point out the flaw I knew Marcus had overlooked in his haste to claim ownership, and watch his carefully constructed legacy crumble. The thought was intoxicating. See? The ego screamed, they need you. He was wrong. I stood up and walked to the cliff's edge, the wind whipping my hair. I looked down at the churning, indifferent ocean. I thought of Marcus, a brilliant man now trapped, a prisoner of a narrative he had to constantly defend, unable to admit a flaw because the story had to be perfect. He had the notes, but he had lost the feeling of the music. And I thought of myself here, in this wild, untamed place, with a sketchbook full of truth and hands dirty with the stuff of life. A strange, quiet wave washed over me, a feeling that had no name in any scientific textbook. It was a mix of pity and a profound, bone-deep peace. His world was a clean room, sterile and controlled. My world had become the ocean, vast and wild and filled with a truth that couldn't be owned. I walked back inside. I didn't reply to Ben's email directly. Instead, I opened a new, anonymous account. I sent a single, cryptic line to him. The conductor is ignoring the rests. The silence between the notes is also part of the symphony. I knew he, a true musician of science, would understand. The truth of the work would find its way. It no longer needed my name attached to it. I closed the laptop and picked up my sketchbook. I turned to a fresh page and began to draw the stranded jellyfish from memory, not as a dying creature, but as a luminous, translucent bell surrendering perfectly to the great, rhythmic tide. He had tried to own a symphony, but I had learned that you cannot own music. You can only let it play through you. The greatest discoveries are not made under a microscope, but in the vast, open expanse of a surrendered heart. The act of sending that anonymous email was like releasing a single, weighted anchor I hadn't realized I was still dragging across the seabed of my life. For days afterward, a strange lightness filled the cottage, a quiet that was no longer deafening but resonant. I expected to feel a nagging curiosity, a desire to know if my message had been understood, if the waves I'd started had reached a distant shore. But there was nothing. The door to that world, once slammed shut on me, was now a door I had calmly, quietly, and irrevocably closed myself. My days fell into a new rhythm, one dictated not by the precise, relentless ticking of a laboratory timer, but by the great, slow breathing of the ocean. High tide was for observation, for watching the waves crash against the rocks, a powerful, chaotic force that demanded nothing but respect. Low tide was for discovery. The vast, puddled shoreline became my new laboratory, a sprawling, open-air campus. My notebooks, once filled with precise measurements, gene sequences, and chemical formulas, began to transform. The pages filled with sketches, but also with words that felt foreign and yet deeply familiar. The spiral of the whelk shell, I wrote one afternoon, tracing its perfect, logarithmic curve, is not a mathematical constant to be solved. It is a memory of the tide written in calcium, a slow, patient history of a life's turning. The sea anemone, I noted, watching one retract into a jeweled knot at my shadow's touch, practices a form of cellular privacy. It does not fight the intrusion, it simply withdraws into its own resilient core until the threat has passed. A lesson in boundaries. This was a new kind of science. See, it was qualitative, not quantitative. It was based on witness, not intervention. I was no longer trying to break the code. I was learning to appreciate the poetry. The anger I had felt toward Marcus began to transmute into something else, a profound, almost sorrowful understanding. He was a man who had spent his life collecting and cataloging the individual notes, believing that if he possessed them all, he possessed the symphony. He would never understand that the music was in the listening. One blustery autumn day, my supply of charcoal pencils dwindled to stubs. The trip to the small town, once a source of anxiety, now felt like a necessary pilgrimage. The general store had a small, dusty section for art supplies next to the fishing tackle. As I gathered what I needed, the old man from my first visit was there. But this time, a woman with kind, intelligent eyes and hair the color of sea foam was with him, arranging a display of locally made pottery. "Finding everything you need?" she asked, her voice as smooth and worn as a piece of sea glass. "Yes, thank you," I replied. "Just some pencils." She glanced at the well-worn sketchbook I had tucked under my arm. "You're the woman from the old marine station, aren't you?" "Elspeth," she said, extending a hand dusted with clay. "My husband told me a scientist was staying out there." "Luna," I said, shaking her hand. "I was a scientist." The past tense felt both strange and liberating on my tongue. "Was," she asked, her gaze gentle but direct. "What are you now?" The question hung in the air. It was the most profound question anyone had asked me in a year. I had no title, no institution, no answer. I simply held up my sketchbook. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I draw." A slow smile spread across her face. "Sometimes that's more than enough. May I?" Hesitantly, I handed her the book. I felt a flicker of the old vulnerability, the fear of judgment, of my work being misunderstood. She turned the pages slowly, with a reverence I hadn't seen since Marcus first looked at my data. But her eyes weren't looking for proof or precision. She lingered on a detailed drawing of a cluster of barnacles, on the delicate, flowing lines of a kelp forest. "You don't just draw what they look like," she said softly, looking up at me. "You draw what they feel like, the weight of them, the patience." She handed the book back to me. "I have a small space in the back of my pottery studio where I show the work of local artists. It's not much, just a wall and some good light. I would be honored to hang a few of these if you'd let me." My heart seized. The old ghosts rose in a chorus. Exhibition, recognition, applause, it was a test. A siren call from the world of external validation I had fled. My first instinct was to refuse, to protect my new, quiet world from the contamination of public opinion, to retreat into my resilient core like the anemone. But then I looked at Elspeth's face, and I saw no agenda, no desire to brand or possess my work. I saw only a genuine desire to share something she found beautiful, and I thought of the life in the tidal pools, unseen, uncelebrated, yet persisting with such intricate grace. My drawings weren't a claim of ownership. They were an act of bearing witness. To refuse to share them felt like a betrayal, not of my own ego, but of theirs. "Okay," I heard myself say, the word feeling small but solid. "Yes, I'd like that." Over the next few weeks, I prepared. I chose a dozen drawings, not the most technically perfect, but the ones that held the most truth. I mounted them on simple boards, giving them space to breathe. Elspeth helped me. We worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated by the gentle rhythm of her potter's wheel. She never asked about my past. She seemed to understand that my story was not in my biography, but in the lines on the paper. She asked what I wanted to call the small collection. The title came to me instantly, a perfect, resonant chord, Tidal Symphonies. The day she hung them, the small studio was filled with the warm, earthy scent of clay and the soft afternoon light. A few locals drifted in. A fisherman, a young couple, the old man from the store. They looked at my drawings with a quiet curiosity. I stood in the corner, feeling strangely detached, an observer of my own life. I overheard the fisherman talking to his wife, pointing at my drawing of the jellyfish. "Look at that," he said, his voice raspy. "Looks like a ghost in the water. You see them sometimes at the turn of the tide. Beautiful, but they don't last." He hadn't seen a biological specimen. He hadn't seen a data point about senescence. He had seen a moment of fleeting, fragile beauty. He had seen the poetry. He had heard the music. A profound sense of peace settled over me, as deep and calm as the ocean at slack tide. I hadn't lost my life's work. I had simply been forced to change laboratories. The quest had not been a failure, it had been a redirection. The universe. C hadn't taken my symphony away. It had simply shattered the walls of the concert hall, forcing me outside to realize that the music had been playing everywhere, all along. And my job was not to be its conductor, but simply, and at last, to be a humble and attentive member of the audience.